in the golden courts of Amarna, where sunlight gilded the walls and priests worshipped the one unseen god, a queen of unparalleled beauty arrived. Nefertiti, whose visage would inspire admiration for centuries, would become a figure entwined with envy, betrayal, and death. Behind her flawless countenance lay the silent tremors of political ambition, secret cruelty, and whispered plots that could destroy kingdoms. This is not a story of legend or myth, but of the terrifying human reality that unfolded in the corridors of power, where beauty itself became a weapon and every smile masked a potential curse. The city of Akhenaten shimmered beneath the relentless Egyptian sun, its sandstone buildings glowing in shades of gold and amber. Into this city, Nefertiti entered, carried on a palanquin by attendants, her delicate frame swathed in linen dyed with the richest indigo and adorned with collars of lapis and gold. The court, already accustomed to splendor, paused in awe. Here was a woman whose face seemed sculpted by the gods, her eyes deep and calculating, her presence commanding yet intoxicating. She was more than a queen. She was a symbol of a new age, and yet, as her steps echoed along the marble floors, tension quietly threaded itself among the onlookers. Akhenaten, her husband and the radical pharaoh devoted to Aten, watched silently from his throne. His expression, both enraptured and wary, betrayed the delicate balance of desire and duty. In this court, beauty was currency, power was measured in whispers, and loyalty was never guaranteed. Nefertiti understood this instinctively. Every glance she offered, every gesture of deference or command, was noted, interpreted, and catalogued by courtiers who longed for influence or feared her ascendancy. To unite was her mission. Yet, unknowingly, she became a catalyst for division. Among the royal women, envy flickered like a hidden flame. Principal wives, previously secure in their influence, now saw a rival whose charm eclipsed their own. Advisors, ever wary of shifting power dynamics, began to speculate in hushed tones about the young queen's intentions. What appeared as grace and elegance was, in the eyes of some, a threat. Even the children sensed the subtle shifts, the tension behind smiles, the unspoken warnings in every ceremonial gesture. Yet Nefertiti moved with the precision of someone aware of her vulnerability. Her beauty was not vanity, it was armor. She laughed lightly at courtly banter, offered gentle nods to those seeking favor, and presented herself with a poise that suggested both humility and inevitability. She knew that each admiring gaze could later turn to resentment, that the same hands that bowed in reverence might one day clutch daggers behind the palace curtains. By the day's end, Nefertiti had cemented her presence not merely as Akhenaten's consort, but as a force within Amarna. Her arrival had changed the rhythm of the palace. Courtiers whispered of alliances to be forged and rivalries to be destroyed. Beneath the golden haze, the seeds of jealousy and political tension took root. In the dazzling light, the court saw only a queen. Yet, beneath the silken layers, a storm of envy and ambition had already begun to stir, an omen that beauty, though divine, could carry a cost far greater than anyone anticipated. The palace of Akhenaten, resplendent in gold and alabaster, concealed more than sunlight. It harbored whispers that slithered like serpents along its corridors. Nefertiti, now firmly ensconced as queen, quickly learned that the grandeur of her surroundings could not shield her from the subtler, deadlier intrigues of court life. The women of the royal household, each versed in the rituals of flattery and subterfuge, observed her closely. Courtiers who had once nodded with obedient deference now measured their words, their gestures, even their breaths, seeking advantage in a delicate game where one misstep could mean exile or death. Nefertiti's days became a careful choreography of appearances. Every smile had to conceal intent, every conversation a delicate balance between friendliness and subtle warning. She began to notice the coded glances exchanged among advisors, the barely audible mutterings behind closed doors. It was not merely politics. It was a theater of cruelty, where the invisible threat of punishment or disgrace weighed upon every decision. Palace etiquette, meant to reflect refinement, had become a weapon. A single mispronounced word or an unintended slight could spark ruin, and Nefertiti, despite her rising influence, felt the ever-present chill of vulnerability. Even those who outwardly welcomed her presence were not immune to suspicion. Foreign envoys, arriving with gifts and silks, watched her with the same caution that courtiers reserved for one another. Diplomacy in Akhenaten required more than charm, it demanded vigilance. Nefertiti learned quickly that alliances were transient, that loyalty could be bought, borrowed, or betrayed in an instant. The palace, gilded and radiant, was a cage of invisible daggers, each poised for the slightest lapse in attention or judgment. The queen observed these machinations with a growing sense of unease. A chambermaid might deliver a message with the slightest inflection that concealed mockery. A scribe's records could twist meaning with a single ambiguous phrase. Jealousy was often subtle, manifesting in small acts of humiliation, a mislaid offering, a delayed message, a whispered rumor. Each act, though minor, carried the weight of consequence. For Nefertiti, it became clear that survival demanded awareness, cunning, and a restraint that dulled the warmth of her humanity. Yet even amid this suffocating tension, she found moments of clarity. In private corridors, away from prying eyes, she would walk slowly, tracing the murals that depicted Akhenet's divine vision of Aten, pondering the fragility of power. These quiet moments revealed a cruel paradox. Her rise to prominence had drawn admiration, yet it had also made her a target. In this court, the same beauty and intelligence that elevated a queen could, with a whisper or glance, precipitate her downfall. As weeks passed, Nefertiti began to recognize the patterns, the alliances formed in shadow, the subtle rules of cruelty that governed every interaction. The court was a living organism, thriving on manipulation and fear. She understood that the palace's golden walls were not merely decorative. They were barriers concealing the mechanisms of control and domination. And within these walls, every ally had the potential to become an enemy, every gesture of loyalty a veiled threat. The queen's brilliance, though admired, was a spark in a tinderbox, capable of igniting chaos with the slightest misstep. By the close of her second month, the shadows had fully revealed their presence. Nefertiti's beauty and influence, though undeniable, had become catalysts for envy, manipulation, and subtle cruelty. In the radiant palace, beneath layers of gold and sunlight, the first true fractures of her reign were forming. Invisible yet lethal, signaling that in Akhenaten, survival depended not only on power but on the ability to navigate a labyrinth of whispered threats and hidden daggers. Nefertiti's visage, striking and flawless, became both her most celebrated asset and her most insidious liability. In the sunlit halls of Akhenaten, courtiers, diplomats, and priests alike found themselves entranced by her presence. Her beauty was more than admiration, it was a force that commanded attention, shifted loyalties, and unsettled the delicate balance of power within the palace. Yet as the awe grew, so too did the currents of envy that surged beneath the polished floors of the royal court. Every glance of admiration from the pharaoh or a foreign envoy sparked quiet resentment in those whose influence had once been unquestioned. It was not merely jealousy that threatened her. It was the deadly calculus of perception. Courtiers began to test boundaries subtly, questioning her decisions in private, spreading rumors cloaked as advice. Servants whispered of favoritism, suggesting that Nefertiti's interventions skewed appointments and rewards. Advisors, previously secure in their proximity to power, now felt the sting of displacement. Even minor errors, misplaced gifts, a misread ritual, a delayed audience were magnified and twisted into evidence of incompetence or malice. Nefertiti understood that beauty, while elevating her, also marked her as a target. The more luminous her presence, the darker the shadows that conspired against her. Foreign envoys, charmed and unnerved, carried tales of the queen's allure beyond Egypt's borders. Gifts of ivory, scented oils, and rare textiles arrived daily, yet each offering carried this subtle threat of indebtedness. Diplomacy became an intricate dance of politeness and caution, where every smile could be interpreted as consent and every compliment as a demand. In her careful attempts to navigate these dynamics, Nefertiti realized the first cruel truths of her position. Admiration could be weaponized, desire manipulated, and envy exacted in ways both public and private. The court itself became a stage for subtle vengeance. Rival queens and concubines orchestrated moments of humiliation under the guise of ceremony, their calculated slights designed to erode her confidence. A misplaced crown here, a delayed procession there, each act, though small, was meticulously recorded in memory, accumulating into a pervasive atmosphere of tension. Nefertiti sensed the silent strategy forming. Her beauty had drawn eyes, but those same eyes now harbored resentment, waiting for opportunity to turn fascination into destruction. Even within her own household, the effects were tangible. Attendants began to whisper among themselves, debating whether loyalty should align with tradition or with the queen whose presence redefined authority. Children watched the shifting dynamics, learning that obedience alone could not guarantee safety. Every interaction became a test of perception, an evaluation of intent. Nefertiti, conscious of the mounting stakes, approached each day with calculated precision, understanding that any misstep could transform admiration into lethal opposition. By the end of the first year, Nefertiti's understanding of beauty as a double-edged sword was complete. Her visage had inspired awe, yet it had simultaneously provoked envy, suspicion, and the beginnings of political sabotage. What had once been an unqualified advantage had become a source of tension, a silent provocateur in a court already rife with ambition and treachery. In the world of Akhenaten, where divine image and mortal ambition intersected, the line between reverence and threat was perilously thin. The price of beauty, Nefertiti realized, was measured not in adornments or accolades, but in the quiet, corrosive fear it inspired. Each smile she offered carried a weight, each gesture of grace a potential spark for vengeance. Her presence illuminated the palace, yet it also illuminated the fractures, the whispered jealousies, and the latent cruelty that would shape the rest of her reign. In Akhenaten, beauty was not merely admired, it was feared, envied, and inevitably punished. In the quiet chambers of the royal palace, a tragedy unfurled that would ripple through the court like a poisoned wind. Akhenaten, Nefertiti's close companion and confidant, collapsed suddenly after a ceremonial meal. What seemed at first a fainting spell rapidly transformed into something far more sinister. Her pulse faltered, her breathing slowed, and her attendants were powerless to intervene. The corridors, usually alive with chatter and ritual, fell into a stunned hush. Rumors ignited immediately, whispering through the palace like wildfire. Poison, betrayal, an intentional misstep, each explanation carried a weight of suspicion that no one dared voice aloud, but all silently acknowledged. Nefertiti, stricken with shock and dread, felt the fragile veneer of security she had cultivated disintegrate in an instant. Akhenaten had been more than a companion. She had been a stabilizing presence, a loyal observer who understood the intricacies of the court. Yet in a palace where every act of devotion was shadowed by ulterior motives, even this bond could not shield her from danger. Nefertiti watched, helpless, as the queenly attendants carried her friend's still body to the inner chambers, the air thick with incense, mourning, and whispered fear. The court was already constructing stories, a rivalry gone too far, an unnoticed slight, or a misinterpreted ritual, each version casting a different reflection of peril upon the queen. The aftermath was as merciless as the event itself. Courtiers began subtly shifting allegiances, some in fear, others in opportunism. Every eye, every gesture, was now read as potential evidence of complicity or innocence. Even Nefertiti's children, young and perceptive, sensed the tension. Noting the quick glances exchanged between advisors and the careful distance maintained by those who once embraced her presence. The palace, gleaming with gold and alabaster, now felt suffocating. Each corridor a corridor of suspicion, each hall a theater for silent judgment. Amid this tension, the queen confronted a haunting realization. No relationship within the palace could be considered safe. Trust was a currency, fragile and easily manipulated. Akhenaten's death forced Nefertiti to weigh her next steps with ruthless precision. Public displays of grief could be perceived as weakness, yet detachment might invite further suspicion. Every word spoken in the halls, every gesture of compassion, carried potential consequences that could escalate into political disaster. Survival demanded more than intelligence. It demanded preemptive cunning, an awareness that even the most intimate bonds could be weaponized. By the week's end, the ripple effects had taken form. Courtiers who had once quietly admired Nefertiti began to probe for errors, testing the queen's composure and resolve. Alliances reconfigured in subtle ways. Whispers carried new meanings. The specter of Akhenaten's death, unexplained and unsettling, remained a constant shadow over the palace. It was no longer merely an event, it was a warning, a lesson etched in blood and fear. Nefertiti, though outwardly composed, internalized the bitter truth. In the corridors of Amarna, loyalty could die overnight, and beauty, influence, or intellect could not protect one from the hidden cruelty of human ambition. From that moment forward, Nefertiti's interactions became sharper, more measured. She no longer relied on assumed loyalty, observing each subtle gesture, each pause in conversation, for the faintest sign of duplicity. The loss of Akhenaten was not simply a personal tragedy, it was an initiation into the brutal reality of the palace. A world where every relationship carried a shadow and where the price of survival was often measured in ruthless decisions, calculated and cold. The queen now understood that power, no matter how luminous, demanded vigilance against both seen and unseen adversaries. Akhenaten's devotion to Aten, the singular sun disk, had reshaped Egypt in ways both magnificent and devastating. The capital, Akhenaten, was a city bathed in light, yet beneath its brilliance lay shadows of suffering. Nefertiti observed, with increasing unease, how religious zeal had become a conduit for cruelty, not devotion. Priests, empowered by absolute authority, enforced strict obedience, punishing hesitation or perceived disrespect with severity. Commoners, their lives once guided by tradition, now endured humiliation and pain under the guise of sacred duty. The queen, who had once marveled at the clarity of her husband's vision, now witnessed the human cost of unwavering faith. Markets that had once thrived were now strained. Farmers, forced into labor for temple construction, returned home exhausted, bringing with them meager harvests and tales of harsh overseers. Bread became scarce, and the city's underbelly simmered with resentment. Nefertiti walked among these people occasionally, cloaked and unrecognized, observing the silent desperation etched into faces. Children, pale from malnutrition, stared at her with uncomprehending fear, while parents whispered prayers not for divine favor, but for relief from relentless demands. In these moments, Nefertiti realized that the sun's radiance could not warm, all it could scorch, illuminate, and expose every flaw, every injustice. Within the palace, rituals grew increasingly elaborate, designed to demonstrate the queen and Pharaoh's devotion to Aten. Nefertiti observed priests administering punishments for minor infractions, a mispronounced prayer, a delayed offering, a failure to bow properly. Each punishment carried the weight of shame and physical suffering. The spectacle, justified as piety, became a tool for control. She noted the tension among courtiers who feared divine reprisal if they misstepped, while others exploited the fear to secure influence. The queen understood that these displays were not merely religious, They were mechanisms of power, turning faith into a weapon and obedience into chains. Nefertiti's emotional turmoil deepened as she considered her own role. Her public appearances, her devotions alongside Akhenaten, were meant to exemplify reverence. Yet, she could not ignore the irony. Her presence, meant to inspire awe, also lent legitimacy to cruelty. Every ritual she performed in the temples, every offering she made, carried a double meaning. To the people, she was a divine figure. To herself, she was a witness to suffering she could not openly alleviate. The burden of observation weighed heavily upon her, instilling a sense of helplessness that threatened to erode her composure. The queen's private reflections often returned to the disparity between appearance and reality. The sun, constant and unyielding, symbolized divine clarity, yet the lives it illuminated were rife with human suffering. Devotion, once a noble pursuit, had become a justification for injustice. Nefertiti began to document these observations mentally, cataloging moments of cruelty, subtle humiliations, and acts of brutality disguised as ritual. She understood that history would remember the brilliance of Akhenaten, yet she also foresaw that the darkness beneath that brilliance could not remain hidden forever. By the end of the year, Nefertiti had begun to navigate this landscape of fear with strategic precision. She offered measured guidance to priests, subtly mitigating excesses where possible, yet always careful not to appear defiant. The sun god's radiance, once a symbol of divine favor, now illuminated a harsher truth. Obedience enforced by cruelty left invisible scars. And the queen, despite her influence, could do little to stem the suffering. In this delicate balance of faith and power, she realized that devotion and duty were often indistinguishable from control and torment, and that surviving the sun's wrath required vigilance, cunning, and an unflinching awareness of the human cost beneath every radiant gesture. Within the gilded walls of Akhenaten, Nefertiti came to recognize that blood, the very essence of family, could be as treacherous as any court intrigue. Brothers, sisters, and even trusted advisors maneuvered for influence with a precision that was almost surgical in its cruelty. Loyalty was fragile, and affection could be weaponized. Each word, each glance, each gesture carried hidden meaning, and Nefertiti soon realized that familial bonds offered no immunity from betrayal. The palace, once a sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of shifting alliances, where survival depended on deciphering intent as much as exerting authority. Her children, innocent in their play and curiosity, were not spared the subtle violence of court politics. Tutors and advisors whispered lessons in obedience and loyalty that carried unspoken threats. Nefertiti struggled with the impossible choice: protect them from the corrosive influence of ambition, or allow them to witness the harsh realities of the palace, preparing them to navigate the treacherous currents themselves. Every decision weighed heavily upon her, for even a single misstep could jeopardize both her children's safety and her own fragile position. The shadows of betrayal seemed to emanate from the very walls of her home, a constant reminder that blood could not guarantee trust. She began to observe the subtle signs of treachery in those closest to her. A lingering look between siblings, a whispered remark behind a servant's back, a carefully timed compliment, all could mask sinister intent. Courtiers feigned loyalty while quietly undermining her influence. Even allies who had shared her triumphs now measured their actions against shifting power dynamics, willing to sacrifice personal bonds for advantage. The queen, whose reputation had been built on both intelligence and beauty, understood that influence in the palace was ephemeral, and that the stakes of betrayal were often fatal. One incident crystallized the cruel reality of family politics. A brother, outwardly devoted, orchestrated a subtle maneuver that jeopardized Nefertiti's control over temple appointments. His actions, disguised as concern for tradition, threatened to diminish her authority before Akhenaten and the priests. Confronting him directly was impossible. Doing so would expose her to the scrutiny of other court factions. Instead, she adapted, responding with calculated restraint and silent observation. Her response sent a quiet but unmistakable signal. She would not be undermined, yet she would not provoke open confrontation. Survival required a measured balance of cunning and patience. The queen's internal reflection became a daily exercise in vigilance. She catalogued every interaction, every subtle infraction, and every potential source of betrayal. She realized that the palace was not a single organism, but a network of competing wills, each vying for power, recognition, or survival. Blood alone did not confer loyalty. Influence was earned, manipulated, or seized. In this context, the first acts of familial treachery left emotional wounds that would persist, haunting her decisions and shaping her perception of every alliance. By the end of the season, Nefertiti had embraced the bitter lesson: power within one's own family was as dangerous as any political maneuver beyond the palace walls. To protect herself and her children, she would need more than charm or intelligence. She would need vigilance, strategic foresight, and an unwavering understanding of human ambition. Betrayal among blood had revealed the cruelest truth of all. Even love could be weaponized, and in Akhenaten, survival demanded the capacity to navigate not only enemies, but the very family one trusted most. A sense of dread gripped the palace when word spread that one of Nefertiti's children, the young heir to the throne, had vanished. The corridors of Akhenaten, usually alive with ceremony and ritual, fell silent with tension. Courtiers, guards, and attendants scurried, whispering theories that ranged from abduction to accident. No one could be certain, yet every shadow seemed to harbor suspicion. The disappearance was not merely a familial tragedy. It was a political earthquake, a shift that threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of power that Nefertiti had so carefully maintained. Nefertiti's grief was immediate, but tempered by an icy awareness of the stakes. In this court, personal sorrow could be exploited as weakness. She summoned trusted advisors, interrogated guards, and retraced the child's last known movements, yet answers were elusive. Every explanation carried a sting of doubt. Was this a calculated act by a rival faction? A consequence of carelessness within her household? Or a tragedy born of chance, cruelly timed to exploit her vulnerabilities? The line between love and political survival had never felt so thin. As hours stretched into days, paranoia seeped into every corner of the palace. Nefertiti scrutinized every glance, every gesture. Even allies previously considered loyal were not immune from suspicion. Whispers of conspiracy infiltrated the royal chambers, hinting that the child's disappearance could be used to manipulate Akhenaten or undermine her authority. Courtiers speculated on who would benefit most, and the mere question of intent became a weapon, turning neighbor against neighbor, sibling against sibling. Nefertiti recognized that fear itself had become a tool of power, one that could be wielded to devastating effect. The queen's emotional burden was compounded by the public eye. Citizens, though unaware of the full scope of intrigue, noted the absence of the heir and speculated wildly. Rumors of assassination or kidnapping circulated beyond palace walls, threatening to erode confidence in the monarchy. Nefertiti, accustomed to wielding her presence as a stabilizing influence, now faced the paradox of visibility and vulnerability. Her grief, if too public, could embolden enemies. If concealed, it could signal detachment or indifference. Every decision, every action, carried implications far beyond her personal anguish. Sleep became elusive, replaced by a constant vigilance that sharpened the senses. Nefertiti patrolled the palace with heightened awareness, noting unusual patterns in servant movements, delayed messages, or subtle changes in tone from her closest confidants. Each anomaly could conceal intent, and in this atmosphere of uncertainty, the queen understood the frightening truth. In Akhenaten, survival required anticipating treachery before it revealed itself. The disappearance of her child was not only a loss of blood, but a challenge to her authority, an invisible adversary that could not be fought with swords alone. By the week's end, while the heir remained missing, Nefertiti had adapted. Her outward composure masked a mind racing with contingency plans, alliances to be secured, and potential enemies to monitor. She recognized that in this court, love, loyalty, and murder were entwined, sometimes indistinguishably. The vanishing of the heir was a brutal initiation into the cruel mechanics of power. Even the most intimate relationships were subject to manipulation, and the line between protection and political survival had become perilously thin. Every shadow now whispered danger, every silence carried threat. And Nefertiti knew that the palace she once navigated with grace had become a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty, where even a mother's vigilance might not suffice. Whispers, once faint and ignorable, had grown into undeniable accusations. Courtiers and priests, emboldened by fear and ambition, began to cast Nefertiti as a potential threat to the stability of Akhenaten's reign. The queen, who had once moved through the palace with grace and authority, now found herself constrained, her influence subtly but unmistakably eroded. Doors that had once opened at her command were now guarded, audiences delayed or denied. The gilded halls of Akhenaten became a cage, one in which beauty and power were no longer shields but liabilities. The exile was not formal, yet its effects were total. Nefertiti remained in the palace, but her movements were monitored, her authority curtailed, and her ability to shape policy diminished. Advisors who had once sought her counsel now avoided direct engagement, fearful of aligning with a queen whose favor could provoke envy or suspicion. The corridor she had walked with pride now felt alien, each echoing step a reminder that survival was no longer guaranteed. The city outside continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the queen's diminishing power, yet within the palace, tension was tangible, almost suffocating. From behind gilded gates and latticework screens, Nefertiti observed the machinery of rule she had once helped guide. Religious ceremonies continued, often with greater rigidity, while punishments for minor infractions were meted out with increasing severity. Courtiers leveraged fear as a tool, and the instruments of control, ritual, decree, and rumor were sharpened against her. She realized that in Akhenaten, exile could be executed without leaving the palace, and power could be denied even to those who had once been closest to the pharaoh. The queen's eyes, though outwardly composed, traced every movement with precision, noting alliances forming in secret, subtle signs of disloyalty, and the silent calculations of those who sought to exploit her constrained position. Despite the isolation, Nefertiti did not surrender to despair. She meticulously catalogued every act of cruelty and manipulation she witnessed, storing knowledge that could be leveraged in future maneuvering. She learned to navigate the invisible boundaries of her exile, engaging when necessary, observing always, and never revealing the full measure of her awareness. The subtle art of survival became her daily discipline, a mental exercise as grueling as any physical trial. The palace, previously a stage for influence and authority, had become a laboratory of human behavior, revealing ambition, envy, and malice in their purest forms. Even the simplest gestures could carry profound meaning. A bowed head, a delayed report, or a seemingly benign comment could signal either loyalty or treachery. Nefertiti learned to interpret these signals with precision, understanding that survival required anticipating betrayal before it materialized. She observed her enemy's reliance on fear as a tool, noting how it corrupted even the most ostensibly honorable men and women. Every whispered accusation, every concealed glance, served to reinforce the precariousness of her position. By the season's end, Nefertiti's exile had transformed her understanding of power. She had once believed that beauty, intellect, and political acumen could secure her influence. Now she understood that these same attributes could make her a target. Observing from behind the gilded gates, She saw Egypt's corridors of authority function as instruments of manipulation and fear. In this gilded prison, the queen learned that survival required not only resilience, but the patience to endure, to watch, and to wait for the subtle shifts that might one day allow her to reclaim even a fraction of her lost authority. The subtle rhythms of the palace had shifted. Behind closed doors, officials whispered of schemes to manipulate Akhenaten's authority, and Nefertiti could sense the invisible hand of conspiracy tightening around the throne. What had begun as veiled suspicion now evolved into coordinated maneuvering, a network of intrigue that implicated her either as a scapegoat or as a silent witness to events she could neither prevent nor expose. Each day brought a new revelation of how fragile loyalty had become and how lethal influence could be when wielded by those who understood the palace's shadowed corridors. Law, religion, and rumor became weapons more effective than any sword. Priests twisted the interpretation of Aten's will to serve factional interests, punishing dissenters while rewarding silent compliance. Advisors and bureaucrats manipulated legal and ceremonial protocols, creating opportunities for blame and obfuscation. Even the simplest decisions could be reframed as errors, transforming allies into enemies and ordinary events into pretexts for accusation. Nefertiti, who had once relied on her beauty and political acumen, now realized that influence itself could be fatal when wielded without absolute control of perception. Fear became the currency of power. The court, once a stage for celebration and governance, had become a theater of psychological torment. Courtiers carefully calibrated their interactions, aware that a misstep could result in disgrace or death. Nefertiti observed subtle patterns, delayed messages, rearranged seating, fleeting glances, and moments of conspicuous absence, all signals of a larger plan unfolding. She cataloged each anomaly, mapping connections, motivations, and potential targets, aware that missing a single thread could imperil not only her position, but the lives of those she sought to protect. The queen's awareness of the stakes intensified her isolation. Trust had become a liability. Even familiar faces could conceal ambition and malice. Family members, once anchors of support, now navigated the treacherous currents of influence with calculated care, their loyalty conditional and sometimes ambiguous. Nefertiti recognized the cruel truth. In Akhenaten, proximity to power made one a participant in its danger, and beauty, intelligence, or devotion could provoke envy lethal enough to end life itself. Each gesture, however benign, might be twisted into evidence of treachery, and each alliance could carry the seeds of betrayal. The psychological burden of observation became constant. Nefertiti had to maintain composure in the presence of the pharaoh, yet remain alert to signs of scheming in his inner circle. Every ritual, every public audience, every silent consultation required vigilance. She understood that being perceived as cautious or calculating could be interpreted as threat or ambition, further complicating her precarious position. The palace was a crucible of strategy, and she could neither afford distraction nor error. By the end of this period, Nefertiti had developed a stark understanding of the deadly interplay between influence and perception. She saw clearly that in Akhenaten, survival was less about power itself than about navigating the lethal subtleties of the court. The conspiracy was a mirror reflecting the harshest truths. Beauty, intelligence, and loyalty could all become liabilities. Observation, patience, and calculated restraint were the only tools to endure. The queen, though constrained and watched, remained vigilant, knowing that each silent step, each measured response, could be the difference between survival and ruin. The world Nefertiti had helped shape now teetered on the brink of ruin. Years of famine had hollowed Egypt's granaries, leaving commoners to scavenge for sustenance, while the palace, still gilded and radiant, felt increasingly hollow. Crops failed in succession, and the Nile, once predictable, brought irregular waters that compounded the despair. The people's frustration became visible in markets and temples alike. Priests scolded the pharaoh while citizens whispered of curses, divine wrath, or royal negligence. Nefertiti observed all with a growing sense of helplessness, knowing that even her influence could not stem the tide of calamity. Political unrest mirrored the natural disasters. Factions within the court, long suppressed under Akhenaten's centralizing reforms, resurfaced with renewed audacity. Advisors who had appeared loyal during periods of prosperity now plotted openly, exploiting public discontent to expand their influence. Spies and informants moved freely, feeding the queen information that often revealed more about personal ambition than collective welfare. Each revelation deepened her understanding. Power in Akhenaten was never absolute. It was fragile, contingent on perception, fear, and opportunity. Allies vanished, sometimes into exile, sometimes into death, leaving Nefertiti increasingly isolated in her struggle to navigate collapsing authority. Even within her family, betrayals emerged with disconcerting regularity. Siblings and children, caught between loyalty and ambition, made choices that imperiled both the monarchy and her personal security. Nefertiti confronted the bitter reality that blood ties did not guarantee fidelity. Familial love was entangled with strategy and survival. She observed the subtle signals of deceit and manipulation in private conversations and ceremonial interactions alike. Every gesture, no matter how minor, carried the weight of potential treachery. In this environment, vigilance was as vital as any military or administrative skill. As external and internal pressures converged, the queen became an acute observer of suffering. Commoners starved, priests punished transgressors with rigid severity, and the city of Akhenaten itself vibrated with tension. Nefertiti's role, once one of guiding influence and strategic counsel, now felt constrained to quiet survival. She noted the human cost of ambition and mismanagement alike, cataloging every act of cruelty, neglect, and opportunism. The palace, which had once symbolized divine order and prosperity, now reflected human fragility, ambition, and moral compromise. Despite the chaos, Nefertiti remained vigilant. Her beauty and intelligence, long tools of authority, were now instruments of survival. She measured every interaction, weighing potential allies against possible enemies, noting shifts in loyalty and intent. Yet even with careful observation, she recognized that the dynasty's collapse was inevitable. The structures that once supported power, wealth, fear, reverence, obedience, were crumbling under famine, betrayal, and political manipulation. Egypt, once stable under the sunlit vision of Akhenaten, now seemed poised to unravel entirely. By the season's end, Nefertiti's reflection on power was stark and unforgiving. She had learned, through decades of influence, that authority carries a cost measured not in gold or territory, but in blood, sorrow, and moral compromise. Allies vanish when they perceive weakness. Enemies rise when ambition meets opportunity. And even those bound by family or devotion can betray with lethal precision. The queen, witnessing the dynasty she had helped shape collapse, understood the harshest truth of all. In the corridors of power, survival is ephemeral, and the legacy one hopes to leave may rest on a foundation already corroding beneath the weight of human folly. In the final years of her life, Nefertiti vanished from the public eye, her fate obscured by the shadows of history. The court that had once celebrated her beauty and influence now spoke her name only in whispers, tinged with fear, regret, and awe. Some suggested she had been forced into exile within the palace itself, restricted to secluded chambers where even attendants tread lightly in her presence. Others claimed death had claimed her, whether by natural means, deliberate poisoning, or the subtle machinations of those who feared her enduring influence. Whatever the truth, Nefertiti's disappearance became an enduring symbol of the dangers that accompany power, beauty, and ambition equal measure. Her absence left the corridors of Akhenaten tense and hollow. Courtiers maneuvered for advantage, no longer tempered by her presence or her judgment. Advisors who had once deferred to her counsel now acted with brazen opportunism, emboldened by the void her silence created. Factions that had feared reprisal now plotted openly, and rituals designed to consolidate authority became instruments of manipulation and fear. The delicate balance Nefertiti had maintained, navigating between devotion, influence, and survival, had been irrevocably shattered, leaving the court exposed to cruelty, intrigue, and moral decay. The queen's legacy, though invisible, lingered in subtle ways. Temples bore traces of her hand in ceremony and design, monuments hinted at her vision, and the memory of her presence informed the strategies of those who survived. Yet even these echoes were tinged with caution. Beauty, influence, and political skill could inspire admiration, but they could also provoke envy and deadly rivalry. The court's whispers of Nefertiti were never merely reverential, they were warnings. In a place where ambition collided with fear, her story served as a grim lesson that those who shine brightest are often consumed most completely. Even in her disappearance, the lessons she embodied were unyielding. Power carries a cost measured in blood, trust, and moral compromise. Alliances, even with the closest family, are conditional, contingent on perception and opportunity. The line between survival and destruction is perilously thin, and influence, no matter how luminous, can become the source of one's undoing. Nefertiti's life, marked by beauty, intellect, and political acumen, had been a constant negotiation with these brutal realities. In the absence of her visible presence, her story illuminated the invisible architecture of fear, loyalty, and ambition that sustained or destroyed the monarchy. By the final season, the queen had become a shadow within her own history. Egypt, though enduring, bore scars of her absence: political instability, weakened authority, and the moral fractures of a court no longer restrained by her vigilance. Whispers of her name carried cautionary weight, a testament to the enduring danger of influence and beauty in the corridors of power. To future generations, Nefertiti became both legend and warning, a figure whose divine allure could captivate a nation, yet whose fate revealed the perilous cost of prominence in a world governed by envy, ambition, and cruelty. The story closes on this haunting truth. In Akhenaten, beauty could be both divine and fatal. Nefertiti's life, her rise and disappearance, embodies the inescapable lesson of human history, that the more luminous one shines, the more deadly the shadows become. Her legacy, though partially erased, endures as a reflection of power's true nature: transient, intoxicating, and irrevocably perilous. The Sun Queen's curse, unlike a god's wrath, was human, calculated, and eternal.